There we go. There's a recording beginning. It's November 17th. This is ESM 105. Thank you all for making it. Thank you very much. Here we are in week 13, which is pretty wild. All right. So we're going to finish up our pesticides, poison, pollution, bioremediation PowerPoint this week. Then it's vacation. All right. We got a week off. Come back and we'll talk about agriculture, water security, a little bit about energy conservation and consumption with a little wrap-up slideshow. And yeah, the last assignments that you've got are quiz 6 and your annotated bibliography, which are both due December 7th. All right? So that's 20 days, I guess, or so from today. So if you haven't started that annotated bibliography yet, get started on it. Remember that on the homepage of Canvas, I've got the instruction guide, and I'm also happy to sit and help you find sources or help you brainstorm a topic or anything like that. Cool? Any questions about that? Okay, easy. Well then, we're going to get back into our PowerPoint and let's get started. Oh, I'm going to knock off these lights at the front. That's better. Yeah. Okay. So we've been talking about terminology for how to discuss poisons, right? What's a poison? What's a toxin? What's a pollutant? Okay. What about persistence? How do things move through the ecosystem? How do contaminants or poisons move through the ecosystem? How do we get exposed to them? Bioaccumulation and biomagnification are two big ecological concepts that are of special interest to those interested in conservation. All right. So remember, bioaccumulation is on the individual scale, where an organism keeps eating something that's slightly contaminated, but because they can't secrete it out of their body, usually because it's not water soluble, it just keeps reaching higher and higher and higher levels in their tissues until eventually it can become toxic to them. Or in biomagnification, an organism does this, keeps accumulating something with a small concentration of contaminant or poison inside of them, and then the next organism up the food chain eats multiple organisms of that type, which have had biomagnification occurring, so it gets, which have had bioaccumulation occurring, so it gets a higher dose. With the example here of DDT moving through systems. We got more about this specific example here, but you know, as a budding conservationist, you have to know about Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Is that a name in a book that people are more or less comfortable with? Kind of. All right, Rachel Carson wrote this book called Silent Spring. It was all about how there weren't birds anymore. Bird populations were declining. What's going on? Why? Turns out it was use of DDT, an insecticide, which was very effective in killing fleas and mosquitoes and was actually pretty darn safe for humans. There are lots of fun images of DDT being sprayed at like a picnic, where there's a bunch of kids playing at a picnic table and eating food, and someone's just fogging them with DDT, and they love it, you know? And salespeople of DDT products would literally go into a city and say, look how safe this is, and they'd drink like a shot of it. And they didn't get any diseases. But the problem was biomagnification was occurring in the system, and birds that were eating insects and then other animals that were exposed to the DDT were getting high levels of DDT in their tissues, which was making their egg shells thinner, all right? And then you got reduced bird populations. There's the Cliff's Notes Silent Spring stuff right there. Okay. Persistence, we talked about it. It really matters how persistent something is in the environment. If we want to know how to target it for control, or how to control, exposure to humans or to other organisms in the ecosystem, which are once again providing essential ecosystem services, which we can't necessarily provide for ourselves. We talked about persistent organic pollutants. I went on a weird tirade about glyphosate, and I kept trying to stress, I'm not a glyphosate apologist or anything like that, but it's often the focus of people who are concerned about herbicides. It focused a lot on glyphosate, and it's led to some issues. See Friday's lecture. Okay, toxicity. Now we got to talk about how we actually measure it. So we can talk about persistence in terms of half-life. How long does it take for half of something to degrade or go away? Sometimes the persistence of a compound varies depending on the environment in which that compound is. Like, to make it really complicated, glyphosate has this huge range in half-life in soils, and that's usually actually due to the soil microbiome. If it's a healthy soil microbiome, the glyphosate gets broken down really quickly. It's an organic compound, it has energy in it, some things can break it down for energy, blah, 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 fine. Okay? That's persistence. But now we're talking about toxicity. And the metric of toxicity that you should be familiar with is the LD50 value. The LD50 value is a value based on animal testing. So you take a poison and you expose animals to different concentrations of it. All right? This poison, this contaminant, whatever this is. Okay? And then you find the dose, okay, where half of the population dies. Now, this is kind of similar to our discussion of persistence and half-life. Some molecules are less stable, some molecules are more stable. So when something's degrading in the environment, this piece of chalk is my enemy. This piece of chalk is like soft. You know that chalk? Where it hits the chalkboard and it makes your teeth hurt? So I'm not using that chalk. We're going to use this one. If you remember our discussion of persistence, things can degrade in the environment in this sort of curve right here. So an LD50 value, a persistence value, a half-life value is informative, but it's good to know what it's actually representing. Similar thing going on with our LD50. Remember, some organisms are naturally going to be resistant to poisons, all right? Not every living thing, even if it's in the same species, responds to a poison in the same way. So the LD50 is the dose at which 50% of the test population of animals dies. So if you're ever looking at an MSDS, which is a materials safety data sheet, which should always be available to you whenever you're working in a lab or working in a space where there are known poisons, known toxic compounds that you're being exposed to, they'll often have this LD50 value. And that tells you, well, at this dose, half of the mice die. Okay? So, it's a good thing to think about. Like, how do we actually measure any of these things? There's a lot of complications with determining LD50s, all right? If you're using mice, for example, there are a ton of different varieties of mice that are used for research. For example, if you're doing cancer research, you might choose to use mice that are prone to developing cancer. So then you can try your cancer treatments out and see if there's actually a reduction in cancer rates. You want the mice to be prone to cancer because you're trying to see if your drug, let's say, treats it. Now, these can be used correctly or they can be misused. This is one of the big studies that came out about glyphosate that the companies used to say people were overblowing the risk, the carcinogenic risk, because researchers were using mice that were already prone to developing tumors as their test organisms, and then showing, look at how high these cancer rates are in our mouse population. You see? So that gives you a higher rate of cancer. Even though there was an increase in the rates of cancer with exposure to glyphosate, you could report something more drastic, like 60% of mice exposed to glyphosate develop tumors. But that's dishonest, and it's bad research. People's hearts are in the right place, but they're not necessarily they're not doing it right. And if you do your research wrong and your heart's in the right place and you find what you wanted to find in the beginning and somebody finds out, they can use it to discredit you and also cast aspersions on anybody trying to do similar research. little bit of a soapbox. I'm soapboxing hard this week, okay? Because I don't know. This stuff it's worth being concerned about. It's worth caring about, you know? It's all worth caring about, of course. Let's talk about acute versus chronic effects, okay? So, acute effects happen after a single exposure. Chronic effects are long-lasting, okay? Now, these acute effects are like, I inhale a bunch of this mysterious dust, and then I have a cough for 2 weeks. I've got all this dust, my body's handling it. Maybe it's just particulate matter, and it's not actually going to lead to any chronic effects. I just now have congestion, okay? So that's an acute effect, an acute exposure. There are also chronic effects where a single exposure, let's say I'm blasted with asbestos because I'm in a place where they are doing a remodel, all right? I'm just blasted with it. I just get one single large dose of that asbestos, I can have chronic effects due to the exposure. So, check this out. You can have acute exposure and acute effects. So a single exposure, single effect. You can have an acute exposure, a single exposure, and then chronic effects. So one exposure, long-term effects. Or you can have a chronic exposure, okay, where you are exposed to something consistently over the course of your life. Me, I love diet soda. I know it's not great for me, but I went to the movies last night, and I always get a large Diet Pepsi, And it's probably not very good for me. And the chronic exposure may lead to health problems. Whereas I might be less concerned about an acute exposure, where I just have one Diet Coke once and decide it's not for me. All right? We cool with the phrases acute and chronic? And okay, awesome. I love it. Risk assessment. Okay. You know what a risk is. A risk, something has risk if there's a possibility of suffering a loss, okay, by doing that behavior. Smoking has a risk to it, okay? Risk assessment is defined on this slide as a scientific process of estimating the threat that a hazard poses, but we also do risk assessments regularly in our lives. The hope is that we are well informed about what the risk actually is, right? Because we tend to at least I do. I drink a lot of Diet Pepsi every time I go to the movies, and I probably don't assess the risk correctly. Yes?
So I have a question about the last slide.
Yeah, let's double back. Boom.
So how do you get chronic effects if you have only acute exposure?
Oh, absolutely. So if you've got, say, an acute exposure to a mutagen, all right, or something that's carcinogenic. Mutagen's a good example because it leads to some difference in your genetic sequence. So you could get exposed to, you could have, here's an extreme example. You're involved in nuclear weapon testing. You were only there for one detonation where you received an acute exposure to radiation. And then you have chronic effects for the rest of your life. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. So if it causes serious damage to your genetic material, that's a way that you can absolutely have chronic effects from acute exposure. Yeah. Awesome. Gotta stop saying awesome when we're talking about these topics, Okay. This slide has too much text on it. Okay. The takeaway is basically just, hey, risk assessment is tricky. Establishing health policy is tricky. You're exposed to a lot of risks in your life. You're exposed to a lot of chemicals in your life. Trying to figure out which chemicals are actually harmful and which ones aren't harmful. And then sometimes certain chemicals are only harmful in combination, or one chemical increases the effect of the other drastically if it's present. So you've got combined effects of exposure, different sensitivities, effects of chronic and acute exposure. It's tricky. Okay, so when you're classifying risks, you need to do good risk assessment. It's not a super informative slide. It just tells you, this is one of those where I could remove all the text and say, it's complicated. All right? Cool. Now let's talk about a nice case study. Something a nice case study. Okay. So PCB, which I've got defined here. Perfect. Where's my acronym? It's polycyclic, I think. Oh my gosh. I swear I defined this acronym. It's one of those chemical acronyms. Oh, here we go. Look at that. I put it in the dang description. I knew it. So somebody, oh yeah, they're not here today, but somebody brought up can I zoom in? Exposure to like heat transfer paper and things like that. Now this isn't a great example of that actually, but so check this out. Polychlorinated biphenyls, all right? They're organochlorine compounds. What does that mean? It's an organic compound with a chlorine in it, at least one chlorine group in it, okay? Carbonless copy paper. Heat transfer fluids, coolant fluids, they used to be used really, really widely. My gosh, get out of here. Do this thing. Okay? They're carcinogenic. That was found, and they were banned. Nobody can use them anymore. Okay? Now, one of the reasons that this was so harmful, okay, is because it moved through, it's persistent. It's a persistent organic pollutant, and it moves through food chains. It can move through even the atmosphere. It travels around, okay? So, study in the Arctic, okay? Study in of Inuit women. You find these Inuit women living in this remote region where they're not exposed directly to these PCBs, okay? And you find that, they actually have higher concentrations of PCB in breast milk than women in Quebec. So what's going on there? Toxin occurring in a remote place. And this is in 1993, so it's pre the ban, right? So it shouldn't be, it's pre the ban, so that means that women in South Quebec were still being exposed. Now, where did they find the high levels? They found them in breast milk, okay? Now, what did we learn about persistent organic pollutants that makes sense in light of where the PCBs were found? In milk. A fat-rich sort of substance. Remember a little bit about this? Think back.
So because there can be high bioaccumulation due to the fact that the substance is
Yes. Yes! Points, so many points. I'll give you 10 John points. Enjoy them. They're worth nothing, and they expire at the end of every day. Good. The answer, for anybody watching on the recording, right, was that they can bioaccumulate, okay, because they are hydrophobic. So fats are hydrophobic substances, so other hydrophobic things will dissolve into those fats. And if you look at the diet of these Inuit women, it's high-fat diet, all right? So you're getting exposed to a lot more fats than maybe the women in Quebec were. So you're getting exposed to more of the hydrophobic, persistent organic pollutants. So it makes sense, hopefully, it links with everything. It's all coming together. Brilliant. Oh my gosh. Bah, my mind, it's blown. I know. So yeah, they remain in the environment for a long time. They're called persistent organic pollutants, okay? Why would they be exposed to these persistent organic pollutants if they don't have industrialized agriculture? How do they get all the way up there? They actually travel atmospherically. So they have high persistence, these ones. They can get produced at low latitudes. They go up, all right, and they precipitate out in snow in the Arctic region. And then animals consume that water. People consume that water. The molecule's hydrophobic, so it gets stuck into fats in their tissues. So it's exacerbated even more by the fact that they're consuming a high-fat diet. All right? Mostly marine mammals. So some communities focus on eating marine mammals. Some don't. Some communities ate herbivorous caribou, and they had lower levels of this compound. And knowing the nature of these persistent organic pollutants and the PCB specifically, it hopefully just, sort of makes sense. Okay. Oh, I forgot I had a Rachel Carson Silent Spring thing here. DDT, all right, it worked really well. Originally, it was used in warfare because I'm sure you've heard this spiel before. Prior to the 90s or the 70s, prior to the 70s, most of the, let's go back further, like 60s, 50s, most of the deaths in war came from, well, really early on, dying from like infections, okay? And then later, it came from pathogens in the environment. So disease being vectored between individuals. So you don't want there to be a bunch of bed bugs. You don't want there to be a bunch of fleas. You don't want there to be a bunch of mosquitoes. So you develop all these chemicals that can just kill the bugs. Then you spray people with them. You go, cool, hey, that worked. Let's start using it for civilian use. Standard issue. Technology is flowing from the military field into the non-military market. Okay? So DDT, biomagnified, all right, went up the food chain, hit the birds, no good, thin eggshells, lower viability of those birds, populations decline. Ban on manufacture and use of DDT in the United States, awesome, good stuff. Also, here's the thing, mosquitoes were developing a resistance to DDT really rapidly anyways because of our whole antibiotic resistance talk, or how organisms can get a resistance to poisons over time. You kill 90% of the mosquitoes, you only leave the mosquitoes that are resistant to DDT, and then in a number of years, the population's majority resistant to DDT anyways. So, yeah, good. Great. We talked about this already. But yeah, the higher up the trophic level these Inuit women were feeding, or the higher up the trophic level that the Inuit communities were feeding upon, the higher the rates of PCBs in their tissues. So that's all an example of biomagnification. If you're eating the herbivores, those have had less of a chance to biomagnify because they've just eaten the plants. Cool, good. Yeah. Pollutants go all over the place, fine. Salmon. Okay. This is just another example, essentially, of a survey in 2003. It looked at these sockeye salmon populations in Alaska. They looked at sediment levels salmon, right? They move from marine to like river environments, about this. They move between these different areas. So as they move, right, they get exposed to different food supplies. They can bioaccumulate. They can transfer materials. So this is given as an example of biological pumping of pollutants, where these salmon, they move back, okay, from the marine environment into the rivers, okay, the riparian environment, all right? And they bring the pollutants along with them, and so that can be a transport of persistent organic pollutants, mercuries, things like that. This is another case study, yeah.
So it's easier for pollutants to accumulate in fat, right? Is that what you said?
If they're hydrophobic pollutants, yeah. Most persistent organic pollutants are hydrophobic because if they're hydrophilic, they don't bioaccumulate because they can be flushed out of the organism. But the hydrophobic contaminants, the hydrophobic pollutants, they'll only dissolve in other hydrophobic substances, like fats.
Okay.
Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It's all, just remember, like dissolves like, so hydrophobic things dissolve in hydrophobic substances. And hydrophobic substances, oils, fats, waxes, the things that repel water. Yeah. You pour some water, take some butter and pour some water on it, and you'll see how hydrophobic those fats are. Okay, great. Just another example here of transport of pollutants. Good. I really just want to get into trying to keep track of which slide we're on. We're doing well. We're through our like terminology portion where we discuss what's biomagnification, what's bioaccumulation, how do we determine toxicity, all right? What's persistence? How do we determine it? What's a poison and a toxin and blah, 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 blah. And now we can start to talk about solid, toxic, and hazardous wastes. So waste products, okay? This is where we're going to talk a little bit about recycling, which is a good case study, you know, in how do we deal with these issues. Yeah. So waste, all right? We've got these figures here. These are municipal solid waste figures, okay? Now, I'm going to point out a few things because if you see these figures in like a textbook, okay, if you miss what data it's actually representing, you can miss a big picture here about like how much waste is being generated via industry and what does their waste look like and what do their waste disposal methods look like. All right, we'll talk about those. But for here, we're looking at municipal waste, and check it out, 300 million metric tons per year. Industrial waste, 400 million metric tons per year. So why do we always focus on municipal waste and municipal waste disposal methods if industrial waste is a larger proportion or a larger quantity of waste generated in the US? All right. Well, the bright side of it is you can have an impact on municipal waste and municipal waste generation and municipal waste disposal. But we can also, as we mentioned previously, have an impact on industrial waste and industrial waste disposal through which markets we decide to participate in and where money goes. Good. Now, this is pretty interesting. So that was my bright side of like, why do we talk about municipal waste? Well, here's the other reason that we talk about municipal waste. The US does not maintain a non-hazardous industrial waste data set anymore. So 1980s, kind of an era of introducing those cost-benefit analyses into all decisions, if you remember that, and a little bit of like deregulation of industries. And if you don't have data about how industrial waste is being generated, how much is being generated, what types are being generated, then you can't really do much about it. You can't say so much about it, right? You can't focus on it so much. They are still required to maintain hazardous waste records, okay? This is sort of the cradle to grave model where you have to keep track of how much of the hazardous waste was generated and where it went until it was eventually disposed of. It's referenced in the Cradle to Cradle book where they're like, hey, we'll take the waste and then use it as something, right? That's their main thesis statement. But check this out. Here's a figure that attempts to get at non-hazardous industrial waste. But it's not a direct measurement maintained by like the government or something where they're keeping track of these things. They keep track of municipal waste because garbage goes through municipal waste streams. But industrial waste streams are different. So this metric right here, in 2024, it's actually trying to get at the different types of industrial waste based on the industries that exist to deal with that industrial waste. So there's a lot of money going around in dealing with agricultural waste and in dealing with manufacturing waste and iron and steel and food and beverage waste and pulp and paper waste. There are other companies, there's a whole waste management industry, and this tells you the percentage of the industry that's made up of people dealing with these different types of waste. So it's just kind of interesting, I think. Maybe not. Okay, so municipal waste, we've got data. Industrial waste, we've got model outputs and some indirect data from industries that exist just to deal with industrial waste. How's that? Is that hard? Good. So there's this number that was thrown around a lot when I was a student, but you'll see it less now, though depending on who you're taking your courses from, they might still be using this 7.6 billion tons of industrial waste non-hazardous industrial waste generated each year, okay? Which, compare it to this number of 400 million, as a big difference, okay? And that, I'll be honest, as a student, when I saw that 7.6 billion ton number, I said, well, then why am I bothering? And I kind of just gave up. I was like, well, okay, I'm not gonna freaking recycle. Look how much more they're generating. They're doing 7.6 billion tons on the industrial scale. No matter what I do, it's not gonna have any impact. Standard issue sort of, perspective. That number though, all right, is based on diluted industrial wastewater. So you take some industrial wastewater and then you dilute it to make it less toxic immediately, and then you put it in a treatment facility or you impound it where it just needs to sit for a while and natural processes happen on it. But water's heavy, all right? And it might not even be poisonous, this water. It's just being kept somewhere on site in impound temporarily. Now that ramps up your industrial waste number drastically, and it misrepresents what the industrial waste streams are. And it makes you think that it's all wastewater, It's important to think about, because then you ignore other aspects of industrial waste, like solid wastes. Okay, so there's a bunch of waste. There's a bunch of stuff that's generated that we're not actually using. Well, just a lot of the time in this lecture, we'll just be thinking about plastic bottles because they're a problem, and we're just going to think about them. Okay? Sound good? So what do we do with waste? The byproducts of industry, or the things that are, byproducts of industry, byproducts of transport, right? What do we do with them? Well, there's this waste management hierarchy, this upside down triangle right here, with the least preferred waste management techniques on the bottom and the most preferred waste management technique on the top. Solid. The least preferred is toss it. Treat it a little bit and then toss it. The most least preferred, the worst option, is don't even treat it, just take it and throw it somewhere, all right? But treatment and disposals are least, preferred sort of way to deal with waste, because then it just sits there, okay? Now, up above on this hierarchy, we've got energy recovery. And energy recovery, usually, it means burn it, okay? Think about plastic for a second. Just imagine it. It's incredible, this material. We love it. I'd live in a plastic house if I could. I'm so obsessed with plastics. Thank goodness for the plastic industry. They're looking out for all of us, because we don't know enough to look out for ourselves, right? Plastics. Eat it. Eat the plastic. Here's the thing. Plastic is oil, right? Petroleum is processed to make solid oil. That's plastic. Why do you think a plastic water bottle is so good at repelling water? Because it's made of oil. It's hydrophobic, okay? So if you burn plastic, you get a really similar energy yield to burning like crude oil. There's a lot of energy in plastic. And then the plastic's gone. So energy recovery is usually take the garbage, try to filter it, okay, to remove anything that's gonna be super poisonous, and then burn it in a special, not foundry is not the right word, but burn it in a special, like a freaking A. It's not a bioreactor, that's something else. There's a facility. I'm just gonna say facility. Lazy. Put it in a fire, burn it, all right? Recover that energy. Boil some water, recover it from steam, or spin some turbines, right? There are ways to burn things and get energy out of them. So that's an energy recovery option, and it's what we're usually talking about when we talk about energy recovery. There are other types of energy recovery, such as harvesting methane gas from dump sites, all right, if you've got a sealed dump, all right, a sealed landfill, there's going to be a lot of activity going on producing methane gases, and you can capture those and then burn them as natural gas, where now they're not in the atmosphere as methane, now they're in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which is a less harmful greenhouse gas. So energy recovery, all right, that's a little bit better than treatment or disposal. In the waste management hierarchy, you then have recycling and composting. And if you remember from Cradle to Cradle, there's some pretty serious critiques in there about recycling. But recycling materials ends up usually taking less energy than mining new materials. All right? So there ends up being a net environmental benefit, and we're not depleting the resources as rapidly because those resources are already extracted from the environment. If we just keep recycling them, we don't have to extract more. Standard issue, recycling. And then at the top of the waste management hierarchy, we've got using things again and reducing the actual production of the waste product. So reducing plastic production or reusing plastics. Standard issue. Like I said, I'm just going to be using plastics as an example because they're a major concern. They're also a big pool of energy sitting there. Like I said, it's basically crude oil as far as how much energy you can get out of burning it. So, you know. Landfill disposal is still super popular. A lot of landfills become golf courses. You know about this? It's pretty interesting. Once you decommission a landfill and seal it all up, they'll just plant turf on top of it and then turn it into a big golf course. There's a ton of them out there. And they usually don't stink that bad. Okay? Open dumps. Big pile of garbage laid bare. Now, when I was a child, I grew up in a very small town, and we still had a burn dump, which was entirely regulated by the citizens as far as what went in there. And then every couple of months, they just burned everything inside of the burn dump. So it was literally just a pile of trash that they would burn. And you would know when they were burning the burn dump because the whole town smelled like burning garbage. No energy recovery here, just a waste disposal method. So open dumps, okay? Pretty common worldwide. Sanitary landfills, okay? In a sanitary landfill, you put the garbage down. Usually you treat it initially. You treat the site. You dig a bunch of dirt up. You treat the site. Maybe you put clay there, or you use a plastic lining to prevent water from seeping out of the site. You lay down a layer of garbage. You lay down a layer of dirt. You lay down a layer of garbage. You lay down a layer of dirt. And you keep on keeping on, and you keep on doing that. Now, as you imagine, you probably need some sort of drainage, because if you've got just a big empty swimming pool full of garbage in your backyard with no drain, eventually it's going to just fill up with water and then overflow. So the layer underneath needs to be permeable in some way, and then the water that leaches out of the sanitary landfill can be monitored, treated before it's used for other sources, other purposes. So there are different, types of landfills, but landfills are still very popular, okay? Oh, little reminder for myself to discuss pros and cons of sanitary landfills affecting decomposition rates. So decomposition, I've talked to you about it from way back when. Remember, it's a heterotrophic process. It breaks things down. It releases carbon into the atmosphere. And people who are like, oh yeah, we should compost everything, they're encouraging decomposition, right? So industrial scale composting would be releasing a lot of carbon-containing compounds into the atmosphere, increasing concentrations of CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere, all right? So a sanitary landfill reduces decomposition rates because it reduces oxygen availability. Is that a benefit or a detriment? How much do you want that garbage to decompose? Actually, that's not even a two-part question. That's just how much do you want the garbage to decompose? Do you expect decomposition rates to actually reduce the amount of waste in that landfill? Not usually, okay? So decomposition becomes a negative aspect, actually. Oh, and then, there's lots of products that are sold as like compostable, or they biodegradable, they decompose naturally. They don't always decompose if they're in a landfill. In fact, they usually won't decompose if they're in a landfill because of the reduced decomposition rates in a sanitary landfill because of oxygen exclusion. You need oxygen for decomposition to occur. Just stuff to think about. Check this out. Let me zoom in on this figure. I was pretty excited about this figure when I located it. It's just nice. It's just a good looking figure. I mean, look at this. It's broken down into different phases. It talks about gas compositions coming out of landfills, okay? So in phase 1, there's a bunch of nitrogen. It gets all chomped up really quickly, actually. Oxygen's released a little bit, okay? When there's nitrogen available, you're gonna get the growth of organisms that are photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, okay? Or, sorry, not chemosynthetic. Chemoautotrophic, and are breaking down things inside the garbage for energy, and they're releasing oxygen. There's all sorts of cool stuff going on in here about oxygen release. But the point is that at a certain point here, you enter this methanogenic phase of the dump's lifespan, where methane levels start to go higher and higher and higher and higher. And then you end up with a pretty high level of methane coming out of dumps. Oh my gosh. I always do that. If I just hit the escape key, it's fine. But check this out. Methane. Methane's worse than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as far as a greenhouse gas goes. Okay? It's more active as a greenhouse gas. You don't want a bunch of methane in the atmosphere. I forget the number. I'm going to say like 100 times as effective as a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. It's a big number like that. It's bad. So you don't want a bunch of methane in your atmosphere. Dumps, landfills, generate a bunch of methane, okay? Methane's also a very high energy gas and can be used as a fuel. Now, where does all the methane come from on the planet? Well, some of it comes from coal mining, and a little bit of it comes from manure management, and some of it comes from landfills, okay? And some of it comes from natural gas and petroleum systems, which of course are going to be like, really rough. But a ton of it comes from enteric fermentation, okay? Which is when rudderal animals fart. So this is like your cow fart section. It's mainly cows. So look at that. The second highest source of methane, all right, in the United States is from the beef industry, or the cattle industry, I guess, right? Pretty interesting stuff. Might have heard about that at some point. But it's one of the reasons that people are like, hey, if we could shift away from raising so much cattle, and eating so much beef, it would be helpful environmentally. This is just one reason that there could be a huge impact of shifting away from beef consumption. All right? Oh, I'm not telling you how to live. I'm just trying to give you some data so that you can make better, risk assessments. Better decisions with how you spend your dollars. Okay. Landfill gas energy projects. Landfill gas energy projects. Landfill gas can be collected and sold as landfill gas, as a product. You treat it, you get a bunch of biofuels from it. Okay? You get a bunch of natural gas from it, really, is what you mainly get. There's a bunch of different check it out. There's a bunch of these different products that can be produced. You have to treat the gas, of course. You got to filter it. You got to do all these things. You got to condense it. You got to burn it and then collect what comes off of the burning. There's all this. It's a whole industry, okay? But it's done quite a bit on the East Coast, all right? Because they've got garbage problems, high population densities, in those areas. And so they got more and more of these landfill gas projects occurring. We got some in California, There's a good amount of funding for projects like this in California that can demonstrate that they reduce greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. And so harvesting landfill gas and then using it as a fuel in other sources, it's considered a net benefit. And they're also, they're more popular in other countries as well. This is just US focused right here. So this is kind of a freaking wild example. What the heck was the name of this garbage barge? It's a famous garbage barge. It was, I'm blanking on it. So embarrassing. Okay, there's a famous garbage barge. All right, right here. This thing left New York, okay? And it was destined for another East Coast location where all the garbage was going to be put into a dump there. But then the place where it was going to go, they decided that they didn't want it, and then nobody took it. And there was a whole story about this garbage barge where the person who owned it, or like put this barge into practice, was like a mobster. It's a crazy story, okay? And he goes to jail for other things, but this garbage was actually destined to go to a landfill gas energy project where he had planned to sell the methane produced from decomposition because he got a good deal on the garbage, because garbage is a product as well that people buy, all right? It's pretty wild stuff. So, ocean dumping, difficult to control, okay? Shipping, okay? Shipping waste, big question. We're going to come and hit that pretty aggressively when we talk about China as a market for buying all of our crappy plastic, all right? We were just shipping tons and tons and literal tons of plastic to China up until like 2017. And then in 2017, they said, we're not taking your plastic anymore, okay? And now that plastic just goes to dumps. So all the plastic that we put into the recycling system, the vast majority of it doesn't get recycled. And it's not because there's no way to recycle it. It's because it's so labor intensive to recycle and sort plastics that we are doing it in the US. And now there's not really much of a market internationally that's willing to accept the nasty excess plastic. So we'll talk about that. It's going to be pretty interesting, I hope. I've got a whole thing about recycling that I'm really excited to get into. A whole bunch of plastic recycling in China. Oh yeah, last city, okay, to stop just dumping sewage sludge offshore was New York City. That was 1992, all right? So ocean dumping's still a problem, happens all the time. And I'm gonna find the name of this dang barge in time for next week. But thank you. That concludes another lecture of ESM 105. And we've got like 110 slides to get through in 2 days. We'll probably have to, finish this up the week after. Our energy talk might end up being like 2 days. I'll just be like, alternative energy, it's an option. Anyways, thanks everybody. Thank you for making it. I'm gonna stop this recording.